So these people made their way into Nicaragua. They were manning these tranques. Like I said, a lot of them were high on drugs, criminals, maras, drug cartels, etc. And the government said to the opposition that we cannot do anything until you remove those tranques, because people cannot go out and vote, people cannot go and participate in a referendum, people cannot basically partake in any form of democracy openly, transparently, willingly, if they are surrounded by people who hate Sandinistas and who are committing all kinds of atrocities in front of their houses in plain sight. Some of the things that they did included when a Sandinista tried to remove a barricade, they shot him. This is a historic Sandinista. They burned him publicly. They draped a Sandinista flag on top of his burning body, and they put a trophy in his hand, and they mocked him. So with that kind of image in your head, you're not going to go out there and vote for your party or vote no on early elections or anything like that. So it was a number one condition, and pretty much only condition, that the Sandinista government had for basically sitting at the negotiating table and saying, and agreeing on what kinds of reforms people want to see. They wanted something right away. They said from the very beginning, this is not a dialogue table, this is a negotiation table for us to negotiate your retirement from the government. You have to go now. And we are going to form a transition government to make the reforms that we need to do. And the president said no. We were elected by 72% of the vote with 68% turnout at the 2016 election. And we are a government of consensus. So we're not going to let a handful of oligarchs and alleged student leaders to dictate what kinds of reforms we're going to make that are going to impact the entire nation without consulting other sectors. So this is a process that takes some time. Why is that necessary? Because one of the main things that the opposition is saying is that the institutions are completely corrupted and that they don't trust them. So if we don't have a process through which we can reform some of these institutions, for instance the Supreme Electoral Council, and create panels within the National Assembly, etc., that people trust, then whatever the result, they're going to say, we're not happy with this. If people vote to have a referendum, they can say, no, we don't want early elections, or yes, we want early elections. If they say, yes, no, we don't want early elections, they're going to say, we don't trust the process. If the referendum says, no, we don't want to have early elections, they're going to say, we don't trust the process. Right, so they've basically created an impossible situation to deal with, and I think it has to do with the fact that they don't have a popular base. So it's not in their interest to really go to elections or have a transparent process to have elections. So they kept the pressure. They kept the pressure going, and Western media continue to report the situation as one of genocide against students and one of intolerance and unwillingness to work with the opposition on the part of the government, and to completely ignore the violence that was taking place at these tranques or roadblocks. And so that's what basically happened up until the Sandinista government, quite astutely, I would say, decided to go out and begin to remove these roadblocks. Why did the government wait so long to remove the roadblocks? There were many people, especially within the Sandinista militancy, who were telling the government, give us arms, give us weapons, because they're killing us. They're marking our homes. Sandinista homes were being marked. They were persecuting people, like the guy that they killed, the historic Sandinista that they killed. And we need to defend ourselves. And the directive from the government to the militancy was patience, restraint. We're not going to arm you, because if we do, there's going to be a civil war, and that's exactly what they want. And protect life. Organize yourselves and protect life. Do not go out there, do not confront. And in time, the brutality increased, because this is all part of the design to make the government bring out the military, to bring out the police, so that they can then take pictures and take video of the police meeting these tranques, which were heavily armed, and then shooting at the tranques to then say that there is a massacre happening. And this is basically the format of the soft coups that we're seeing these days. Is basically, take some kind of social issue, manipulate it, use it to throw people into the streets, and then have shooters, sharpshooters or snipers, shooting at both sides to create confusion and then to blame the government and then to increase popular pressure and to continue building this image of genocide and massacre, etc. So the government said, we're not going to play that game. We're going to just protect life as much as we can. We're going to go after the heads of the criminal element. And slowly but surely, they began to expose themselves for their brutality, their intolerance, their lack of desire to have an open, transparent process. And I think that also the different actors were exposed. For instance, the Catholic Church was found to have become a safe haven for criminal activities and criminals and gang members. There are videos of young Sandinista youth being tortured in the presence of priests who are saying, don't load that into the internet, don't load that. There's a video of an entire town that realized that Basilica was housing some criminals, and that they had, one of the things that they did was that they ransacked the local clinics to put pressure in that way as well. So they took all the medicine from the local clinics that were state clinics, and they brought all that medicine into the safe havens, which were the universities, because there's an autonomy law that police cannot penetrate the university without permission from the president of the university union. And so basically they use these safe havens to store weapons, to store medicine, to store drugs. And the people found that out, and there was a big demonstration. They surrounded the church. The bishops showed up, and the people were yelling at the bishops, telling them, why have you allowed this? Why have you allowed this? They had to call the cops to protect the bishops from the people who were angry at the bishops who showed up. The bishops themselves went to the basilica to basically save the criminals who were being housed there, who had been disguised by then as altar boys. And so there's footage of all of that. And when that ended, they basically used that incident to say that the police had assaulted the bishops. And so, like, people were able to see that. People were able to see that the church was not in any position to mediate, that the church was very politicized, that it was very anti-government, and that it was very, very complicit in a lot of the crimes and a lot of the brutality. People saw that the people at the tranques were not students. People saw that they were well-armed, that they were well-fed. They also were able to recognize that a lot of the leaders from the MRS were the ones who were feeding the money and the drugs and a lot of the weapons and things like that into the safe havens where people were pretending to be students. And so by the time the Sandinista government sent out the police to disassemble these tranques, they worked in coalition with police, with voluntary police, which is something that has always existed in Nicaragua under Sandinismo. And they were working with people from the town who were fed up with the violence and the intimidation and the lack of freedom. So by and large, the disassembling of these tranques was very peaceful. It was very consensual. It was very people-led. And we find ourselves right now at a time when the government is in a stronger position to decide who will mediate, to decide when and how we're going to deal with the situation, constitutionally, electorally, etc. The opposition has lost its power to summon people in their marches. They lost the church. The Pope got involved, and he's now sending a lot of the bishops away. The ones who were leading the charge. It's not all the bishops, but there were like 3 or 4 who were like particularly vicious. People started turning against them as well. And if you see like the turnout at the sermon, is also that has suffered as well. All that to say that the movement was defeated temporarily. The opposition movement, the coup movement, was temporarily defeated. As soon as that happened, the United States Agency for International Development announced an extra $1.5 million in aid to the opposition. Basically, what they call it is pro-democracy activities. And now we're starting to see a resurgence of, people burning tires and things like that. It seems as though they don't have a lot of popular power, but they're trying. The main focus right now is the international community. What they're trying to do is they're trying to isolate Nicaragua, portray it as this horrible dictatorship, this violent dictatorship. And that's why I'm here, because there's basically no one else traveling and speaking about what's really happening in Nicaragua. And that's where we are right now. So it's really important for you all to not only listen to what I have to say, but to also check for yourselves. This is all out there in the open. USA is not hiding. You know, they brag about doing the work of the CIA in plain sight. The National Endowment for Democracy brags about laying down the foundations for insurrection in Nicaragua in an article that they wrote for Global Citizens. I want to talk a little bit now, having explained more or less what happened and where we are. How much more time do I have? Maybe another 10, 15 minutes?
That would be good. Do you want to show the videos?
No, not yet. We'll wait until the end.
Maybe 10 minutes.
Maybe 10 minutes, okay. So, when you look at regime change operations, when you look at the involvement of the Soros Foundation, the Open Society Foundations, when you look at the involvement of USAID, NED, the National Democratic Institute, which is led by Madeleine Albright, the International Republican Institute, the Albert Einstein Institute, that's Gene Sharp's institute. What you see is you have like a lot of grassroots activities that are happening under the guise of peaceful, non-violent, pro-democracy activities. What they do is that they embed themselves in universities, and they train students on the use of social media. They train students on how to use symbols, how to make things go viral on Facebook and Twitter and things like that. And there's a lot of ideological training to basically generate hatred for anything that's left, not just the Nicaraguan government, but some of what's happening in Venezuela, which if you look at what's happened in Venezuela, it's almost exactly the same. You look at the symbols, you look at the organizations behind, you look at the economic model that's at stake, and it's basically the same players. You follow the money trail, it's the same people funding it, the same organizations funding it, etc. And there's usually some kind of International Monetary Fund or World Bank or some kind of other, free trade deal or something, in the background that never gets mentioned. In the case of Nicaragua, there's the NICA Act, which is something that a lot of legislators are pushing for, that basically seeks to strangle the Nicaraguan economy through an economic embargo by preventing other financial institutions from investing in Nicaragua or giving loans or credits. And the IMF, in turn, has told the Nicaraguan government, hey, look, you gotta get your house in order, you gotta fix your retirement system, so that if they pass the NICA Act, then you'll be okay because people will have credibility, that people will believe in your system. And so what you need to do, this is the reforms, what you need to do is you need to cut 53,000 people out of retirement. These 53,000 people, Nicaragua's poorest people, what they have is a reduced retirement benefit. Reduced retirement benefit because these are people who had loved ones who were killed in the war with the Contras and were left destitute. And so the government created a program to give them a reduced pension. Not only the Sandinistas, the Contras as well. So you have the relatives of Contras who were killed, the relatives of Sandinistas who were killed in the war, receiving this reduced pension, which includes, of course, health care. A lot of the money that goes into the Social Security system in Nicaragua is for health care. And so that also includes people who are not able to contribute enough to qualify for retirement because our economy was shattered. There was no formal economy. So a lot of people did not contribute enough. And the government said, we're not going to throw them under the bus. We're going to give them a reduced pension. And this makes up the 53,000 people that the IMF said you have to cut them out to balance your deficit, You also have to increase retirement age from 60 to 65 years of age. And you need to double the amount of contributions that a person has to make in order to be able to retire. So from 750 weeks to 1,500 weeks. These were the original reforms. This is what the IMF brought to the table. A table that is a table of consensus. The three main groups that are there is the government, workers' unions, and the big private enterprise, the private sector. The government said, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to keep everybody on retirement. We're going to make a transfer of 5% into the healthcare element to balance it. We're not going to increase the amount of contributions. And what we're going to do is we're going to increase, we're not going to increase the age, we're not going to increase the number of weeks, but we are going to increase contributions made by employees and employers. So employees would have seen an increase of 0.75% in the contributions that they make, and employers eventually would have seen an increase of 3.75% in the contributions that they made into Social Security. In addition to that, there was a tax reform that basically removed the ceiling on the top salaries in Nicaragua. And so the wealthy would now have to pay in accordance with the money that they make. Of course, the wealthy went crazy. They were the ones who called the first protest and lied about a student being murdered, and then lied about the opposition being peaceful. Now we know that nobody died on April 18th. We know that the first 3 people who were killed included only one student who was a protester, one person who died elsewhere who was not politically involved, and one police officer. And they all died from a gunshot wound from a high caliber rifle from a very far away distance, pointing to the use of snipers, which is also another very permanent feature in regime change operations, is that take a social issue, turn it into a social explosion, throw people into the streets, and then shoot at everybody, create confusion, and then let that snowball to create a state of ingovernability and chaos, and then use that to overthrow the government. And so that was the manipulation that led to the initial protest. Like I said, the counter reforms were rolled back 4 days later. They called for national dialogue. They agreed to the church. Nothing worked. It's continued to be highly manipulated situation. A lot of the one of the reasons I say to people, the nice people outside, that we couldn't have a debate here is because corporate media has basically provided in its entirety the other side. Videos, images, testimony have all come from one side. And all we have right now, at least here in San Francisco right now, is me. So I don't think it's fair to give them equal. So we're gonna watch some videos now.
Let's do the break and set up the videos while we do the break, okay?